You people should learn to stay quiet." The words didn't just land, they echoed, sharp and clean, slicing through the low jazz and the quiet clink of crystal glasses in a private dining room perched 50 floors above Manhattan, where every seat at the table was worth more than most people's yearly salary and every conversation carried the weight of millions. Ethan Caldwell leaned back in his chair, tailored suit flawless, a glass of bourbon resting between his fingers. His eyes scanning the room like he owned not just the deal on the table, but everyone breathing around it, and when his gaze passed Naomi, it didn't stop, it never did, because to him she was background, movement without meaning, a uniform without a voice, just another black waitress refilling glasses no one remembered asking for. But Naomi Brooks noticed everything, the way his screen tilted just enough for numbers to reflect in the polished surface of the table, the way one investor kept tapping his pen too fast, the way a single line in the document didn't align with the rest, and she carried it all silently, like she had carried every dismissal, every glance that slid past her, every moment the world decided she didn't matter. "Hey," Ethan snapped his fingers without looking, the sound dry, practiced, automatic. "Top this off," and Naomi stepped forward, her movements precise, controlled, pouring the bourbon without a single drop wasted, her face calm, unreadable, but her eyes lingered half a second longer than they should have on the numbers glowing from his laptop. Across the table, a laugh broke out, loud, careless, the kind of laugh that assumed it would never be challenged, and Ethan joined it, shaking his head slightly as if amused by something only he understood. "It's amazing," he said, voice smooth, carrying just enough to be heard by everyone, "how people can stand this close to power and still have no idea what they're looking at." A few heads nodded, a few smirked, and somewhere in the room, someone avoided eye contact, because even among the powerful, there were lines you didn't cross out loud. Naomi set the bottle down gently, the soft click against the table barely audible, but something had shifted, something small and invisible, like the moment before a storm changes direction, and for the first time that night, she didn't step away immediately. Ethan noticed it then, just a flicker, a pause where there shouldn't be one, and his eyes finally landed on her, not fully, not respectfully, but enough to acknowledge that she existed. "Something you want to say?" he asked, the edge in his voice light but deliberate, a test, a dismissal already forming before she could answer. Naomi met his gaze, steady, unshaken, her voice quiet but clear. "I just thought you'd want to know," she said. And the room didn't stop yet, not completely, but it slowed, like a breath being held without anyone realizing why. That line on page 7, it doesn't match what's on page 12, and for a fraction of a second, nothing happened, the city lights still glowing beyond the glass, the music still playing somewhere in the background, the deal still alive on the table, until one man across from Ethan stopped tapping his pen, until another leaned forward, until the laughter that had filled the room just moments ago didn't come back, because something in her tone wasn't guessing, wasn't hoping, it was certain, and certainty, in a room built on control, was the one thing no one could ignore. The silence did not break all at once, it fractured, slowly, unevenly, like glass under pressure, one investor leaning forward, another narrowing his eyes at the document glowing on the screen, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before he fully understood it, that subtle shift in the room where control begins to slip, where attention moves away from him and locks onto something else, something smaller, something he had dismissed seconds ago. He let out a short laugh, forced this time, controlled, the kind of laugh meant to reset the room. "That is not possible," he said, smooth, confident, already reaching for his laptop as if the act itself would erase the doubt, but his fingers paused just a fraction longer than they should have over the trackpad, and Naomi saw it, that hesitation, that first crack in a man who had built his entire identity on certainty. Page 7 outlines the projected acquisition cost, she continued, her voice still calm, still respectful, but no longer invisible. And page 12 recalculates it with a different variable that was never disclosed, and now the room was no longer slowing, it was stopping, conversations dissolving mid-sentence, glasses left untouched, because no one in that room had made it to where they were by ignoring numbers that did not align. The man with the pen flipped his copy open, faster this time, scanning, his lips pressing into a thin line, while another investor adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the screen, and Ethan felt the weight of their focus shift entirely, no longer on him as the leader of the deal, but on the possibility that something had been missed, something critical. "That is just a formatting inconsistency," Ethan replied, sharper now. the warmth gone from his tone, replaced by something tighter, something defensive, and he finally looked directly at Naomi, really looked at her this time, as if trying to understand how someone he had reduced to background noise was now standing at the center of his negotiation. Naomi did not move, did not step back, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture steady. "No, sir," she said gently, and there was no challenge in her voice. No arrogance, just clarity. "The numbers are off by 12%, which means the valuation you are presenting is inflated by nearly $24 million, and that was the moment it happened, the exact moment the room shifted completely, because numbers like that did not whisper, they echoed, they carried consequences, they changed outcomes, and the man with the pen stopped flipping pages altogether, his eyes locking onto Ethan with something colder now, something calculating. A chair creaked softly as someone leaned back, another guest exhaled under his breath, and the low hum of the city outside the glass suddenly felt louder than anything inside the room. Ethan's jaw tightened, his mind racing through possibilities, explanations, exits, but none of them came fast enough, because the truth had already been placed on the table, and it was not loud, it was not dramatic, it did not need to be, it simply existed, undeniable and precise. "Where did you learn to read financial documents like that?" one investor asked quietly. Not looking at Ethan anymore, but at Naomi, and that question, simple as it sounded, carried a weight no one had expected, because it acknowledged her, not as staff, not as background, but as someone who had just altered the direction of a multi-million-dollar deal with a single observation, and for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell did not have the room, he did not have the control, and he did not have the answer. The question did not float, it settled, heavy and deliberate, and for a moment Naomi did not answer, not because she could not, but because she understood exactly what had just changed. The room no longer saw her as invisible, and that kind of attention came with a different kind of weight. She glanced briefly at the open document, then back at the man who had asked, her expression steady. "I read what is in front of me," she said simply, and there was something about the way she said it that made it clear this was not luck, not a guess, but practice, discipline, something earned long before this room ever noticed her. Across the table, the man with the pen closed the folder slowly, his jaw tightening as he looked at Ethan. "She is right," he said, calm but firm, the kind of tone that did not invite argument. "These projections do not reconcile," and just like that, the last thread of control Ethan had been holding onto slipped. Not dramatically, not loudly, but completely. He straightened in his chair, forcing composure back into his posture. "We can clarify that adjustment," he replied, his voice measured, but the confidence that had filled the room earlier was no longer there. It had thinned, stretched too far, and everyone could hear it. Naomi remained still, but inside, something else moved, a quiet memory, late nights under dim light, textbooks open, numbers scribbled across pages while the rest of the world slept, the sound of rejection letters read in silence. The understanding that knowledge did not need permission to exist, even if opportunity did. "It is not an adjustment," she said gently, not interrupting, but not backing down either. "It changes the entire risk structure of the deal," and now the shift was undeniable. Investors exchanging looks, subtle but sharp, recalculating, reassessing, because money did not follow ego, it followed truth. One of them leaned forward, fingers steepled. "If that is the case, then the valuation is not just optimistic, it is misleading," he said, his gaze fixed on Ethan, and the word hung there, heavier than anything spoken before, because in rooms like this, reputation was currency, and once it cracked, it did not repair easily. Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that tried to buy time. His mind moving fast, searching for a way to reframe, to regain ground, but every option now had an audience that was no longer on his side. His eyes flicked back to Naomi, studying her in a way he had not bothered to before, as if trying to understand how someone he had dismissed seconds ago had just redirected the trajectory of a deal worth more than most people would see in a lifetime. "Who are you?" he asked, quieter now, not as a challenge, but as a question he actually needed answered. And for the first time that night, it was not about power, it was about understanding. Naomi held his gaze, not with defiance, not with pride, but with something far steadier, something that did not rise or fall with the room around her. "I am the one who noticed," she said, and the simplicity of it carried further than any title ever could, because in a room full of powerful people, the only thing more dangerous than authority was awareness, and in that moment, everyone knew exactly who had it. The room did not recover, it recalibrated, and that difference was everything, because silence no longer belonged to power, it belonged to doubt, and doubt spread faster than confidence ever could. One of the senior partners leaned back slowly, his eyes still fixed on the document. "We need to pause this discussion," he said, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of authority that did not require volume, and just like that, the momentum Ethan had built over weeks, maybe months, began to unravel in real time. A server in the corner stopped mid-step, unsure whether to move or stay invisible. The music still played but no one heard it anymore, and Naomi remained exactly where she was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, simply present in a way that could no longer be ignored. Ethan closed his laptop halfway, then opened it again, as if the action itself might change what was on the screen. But numbers did not bend for pride, and the more he looked, the more precise her observation became, each line reinforcing the same conclusion he could not escape. "This does not invalidate the entire deal," he said finally, his tone controlled, measured, but now carefully chosen, every word placed instead of assumed. "It just requires clarification." But the word clarification no longer carried weight, not after what had already been revealed. Clarification should have come before presentation. Another voice responded, sharper this time, and the room shifted again, not toward Naomi, but away from Ethan, because trust, once questioned, rarely returns in the same form. Naomi felt it too, not as victory, not as satisfaction, but as a quiet shift in gravity. The same room, the same people, but a completely different center, and for a brief moment, she remembered standing in another room years ago, smaller, colder, being told she was not the right fit, that her profile did not align, that her perspective was not what they were looking for, and she had nodded then, just like she had nodded tonight. But back then no one had asked her what she saw. "Where did you learn this?" the investor asked again, more directly now, and this time the room waited for the answer, not out of curiosity, but because it mattered. Naomi exhaled softly, her voice steady. "I studied finance," she said, and the simplicity of it carried a quiet weight. "I graduated top of my class." A few eyes widened, subtle but real, because the gap between what they assumed and what stood in front of them was no longer small, it was undeniable. Ethan looked at her again, longer this time, the arrogance that had defined him earlier replaced by something else, something closer to recognition, or maybe realization. "Then why are you here?" he asked, and the question was no longer dismissive, it was genuine, almost uncomfortable, because the answer would not just explain her, it would reflect on the system that had placed her there. Naomi held his gaze, not with anger, not with accusation, but with a calm that came from understanding more than she needed to say. "Because no one in rooms like this was listening," she replied, and the truth in her words settled deeper than anything else that had been spoken that night. Because it was not just about one deal, or one mistake, it was about everything that had been overlooked before this moment, everything that had been dismissed without ever being seen, and in a room built on influence, the most powerful thing that had entered it was not money, not status, but a voice that had finally been heard. No one reached for their drink anymore. Not because they forgot, but because the room had moved past comfort and into calculation, and in rooms like this, calculation replaced everything. One of the investors slid the document back onto the table, slower this time, deliberate. "If this discrepancy holds, we are not discussing a minor correction," he said, his voice calm but edged with consequence. "We are discussing a structural misrepresentation," and the word lingered, heavier than before, because it did not accuse loudly, it concluded quietly. Ethan did not respond immediately, his eyes still on the screen, scanning, recalculating, searching for something that could still anchor him. But every path circled back to the same place, the same flaw, the same oversight that had now been exposed in front of the only people whose approval mattered. Naomi watched without expression, not because she felt nothing, but because she had learned long ago that moments like this were not about emotion, they were about clarity, and clarity did not need to raise its voice. "We should bring in your financial team," another partner added, leaning forward slightly. "Before this proceeds any further," and the shift was complete now, control had moved, not to Naomi, but away from Ethan, and that difference was enough to change everything. Ethan finally closed the laptop, slowly this time, as if acknowledging what he could no longer deny, and when he looked up, the confidence that had filled his posture earlier was replaced with something quieter, something more measured. "We will review it," he said, choosing each word carefully, not commanding, not leading, but stabilizing what remained. Across the table, a subtle nod passed between two investors, silent communication that carried more weight than any spoken agreement, because trust had already been recalculated, and it would not return to its original value without proof. Naomi took a small step back then, not retreating, but returning to the role the room had assigned her, yet the role no longer fit the same way, because once seen, a person does not become invisible again. The manager near the entrance shifted uneasily, unsure whether to intervene or remain still, because even the hierarchy of the room had blurred, the lines between service and influence no longer as clear as they had been at the start of the night. Ethan's gaze followed Naomi for a moment, not with dismissal, not with irritation, but with something closer to recognition, as if he was trying to understand how easily he had overlooked what was now impossible to ignore. "Wait," he said, the word quiet but enough to stop her, and the room noticed again, not because of the volume, but because of who said it. Naomi turned slightly, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and for the first time that night, Ethan did not speak down to her, did not gesture, did not assume. He simply asked, "If you saw that so quickly, what else did we miss?" And the question was different from all the others, because it did not challenge her, it invited her, and that shift, subtle but undeniable, carried more weight than the deal itself. Naomi held his gaze for a brief moment, measuring not his power, but his willingness to hear, and then she spoke, her voice even, clear. "That depends," she said softly, "on whether you want the truth, or just something that sounds like it." And in a room built on influence, that distinction became the only thing that mattered. The question did not rush the room, it settled into it, quiet but undeniable, and for a moment no one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because they understood that whatever came next would not just shape the deal, it would redefine who held the weight in the room. Naomi did not answer immediately, her eyes briefly shifting to the table, to the documents, to the patterns no one else had noticed until now, and then back to Ethan, steady, unshaken. "If you want the truth," she said, her voice calm but precise, "then you did not just miss one inconsistency," and that was enough to draw every ounce of attention back to her, not out of curiosity anymore, but necessity. One of the investors leaned forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "Go on," he said, not commanding, not dismissive, but listening, fully, and that shift alone carried more power than anything Ethan had said earlier in the night. Naomi took a small breath, not to prepare, but to align. The projected growth rate assumes a market expansion that has not been approved yet, she continued, her tone even, each word placed with intention, and if that approval does not come through within 6 months, the entire model begins to collapse under its own assumptions. And now the silence was no longer fragile, it was heavy, grounded, the kind of silence that follows something real. Ethan's expression tightened, not with anger, but with recognition, the slow, uncomfortable awareness that the foundation he had trusted might not be as solid as he believed, and for the first time, he did not interrupt, he did not redirect, he simply listened. Across the table, a quiet exchange of glances passed between two partners, subtle but decisive, because this was no longer about presentation, it was about exposure, about what had been overlooked, or worse, assumed away. "And there is more," Naomi added, not raising her voice, not pushing, just continuing, because truth did not need urgency, it carried its own weight. "The contingency plan references a fallback strategy that is not actually funded, and that detail, small on its own, landed harder than anything else, because it revealed not just a gap, but a pattern, a series of assumptions stacked on top of each other, waiting to be believed rather than verified." A low exhale moved through the room, not loud, but collective, the sound of recalculation happening in real time, and Ethan felt it, the shift from confidence to caution, from control to scrutiny, and he understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before, that the room did not follow titles, it followed certainty, and certainty had just changed hands. He leaned forward slightly, his posture no longer relaxed, no longer performative, but engaged, focused. "If you are right," he said, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier edge, "then this deal does not just need revision." He paused, not for effect, but because the realization was still forming, it needs to be rebuilt, and no one disagreed, not because they were convinced by him, but because they had already been convinced by her. Naomi did not react to the shift, did not claim it, did not hold on to it, she simply stood there, present, as she had been from the beginning. But now the room saw her differently, not as someone passing through, but as someone who had changed the direction of everything without raising her voice, without demanding attention, simply by seeing what others had chosen not to look at. And in that moment, the most powerful thing in the room was no longer influence, no longer money, but the quiet clarity of someone who had nothing to prove, and everything to reveal. The air in the room felt different now, heavier but sharper, like every word carried more consequence than before, and no one reached to interrupt because they all understood something fundamental had shifted, not just in the deal, but in who was guiding it. One of the senior investors adjusted his seat, leaning forward with a focus that had not been there at the start of the night. "If what you are saying is accurate," he said slowly, his eyes fixed on Naomi, not Ethan, "then we are not evaluating opportunity, we are evaluating risk disguised as opportunity," and that distinction landed deep, because it reframed everything they had gathered for. Naomi gave a slight nod, not in agreement, but in confirmation. "Yes, sir," she replied, her tone respectful but unwavering, "and the longer it goes unchecked, the more expensive that mistake becomes," and the numbers did not need to be repeated, because everyone in that room could already calculate the scale in their head. Ethan remained still for a moment, his hands resting on the edge of the table, no longer gesturing, no longer directing, just present in a way he had not been before, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried something unfamiliar, not weakness, but awareness. "Why did no one else catch this?" he asked, not accusing, not defensive, but searching, and the question did not belong to the room, it belonged to him. Naomi considered it briefly, not as a challenge, but as something she had seen before. Something she understood too well, because everyone was looking at the outcome. She said, her voice calm, measured, not the structure that leads to it, and that answer settled deeper than any explanation could, because it was not just about this deal, it was about how power often moved, fast, confident, and sometimes blind, across the table. A quiet murmur of agreement passed, subtle but real, and one investor closed his folder completely, signaling a decision without needing to announce it. "We're going to need a full reassessment," he said, his tone final, not open for negotiation, and just like that, the deal that had once felt inevitable was now uncertain. Ethan exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but acceptance, the kind that comes when resistance no longer serves a purpose, and his gaze returned to Naomi, steady, no longer overlooking, no longer dismissing, but recognizing, truly recognizing. "You saw all of this in a matter of minutes," he said quietly, and there was no disbelief in his voice, only respect forming where it had not existed before. Naomi did not respond immediately, not because she did not have an answer, but because the moment did not require one. Her presence had already said enough. The city lights beyond the glass continued to glow, unchanged, indifferent to what had just happened inside, but within the room, everything had been altered, the hierarchy, the assumptions, the certainty that once defined the space. Ethan straightened slightly, not reclaiming control, but recalibrating himself within the new reality. "Stay," he said, not as an order, but as a request, and the word carried a different weight now, one that acknowledged rather than commanded. Naomi paused, just for a second, feeling the shift fully settle, and for the first time that night, she was not being asked to serve, she was being asked to be heard, and that difference, quiet but undeniable, marked the moment where power did not disappear, it changed direction. The word stayed in the air longer than it should have, not because it was loud, but because it was new, and in a room like this, new meant important. Naomi did not move immediately, her hand still resting lightly against the edge of the table as she measured the moment, not the man, not the money, but the shift itself, the quiet transformation of a space that had once ignored her and now waited for her. Across the table, one of the investors leaned back, studying Ethan with a look that was no longer impressed, but evaluating. "If she stays," he said carefully, "then she is part of this discussion," and the statement was not a suggestion, it was a condition, and that alone made it clear how far the balance had tilted. Ethan nodded once, not quickly, not reluctantly, but deliberately. "She is," he replied, and for the first time that night, there was no edge in his voice, no assumption beneath it, just acknowledgement. Naomi stepped closer to the table, not as a server returning to duty, but as someone stepping into a role that had not been offered before, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, but the space around her had shifted, widened, made room for her presence. The documents were turned slightly toward her now, subtle but intentional, and one of the partners slid a pen aside, clearing the space as if to signal that what came next would not be written without her input. "Walk us through it," he said, his tone direct, focused, and Naomi glanced at the pages again, the same numbers, the same structure, but now seen by everyone instead of just her. "The issue is not just the projection," she began, her voice steady, clear enough to carry without effort, "it is the assumption behind the projection," and as she spoke, the room followed, not interrupting, not redirecting, because they understood that clarity had already proven itself more valuable than authority. She traced a line with her finger, not touching the paper, just guiding the eye. This growth rate depends on a regulatory approval that has not been secured, she continued. And if that approval is delayed, even by a quarter, the entire forecast becomes unstable. And now the investors were not just listening, they were seeing the numbers aligning in their minds the way they had aligned in hers minutes ago. Ethan watched her, not the document, not the others, but her, his focus sharp, attentive, and something in his expression had changed, not just recognition, but respect, the kind that is not given easily and not taken lightly. And the contingency plan, Naomi added, her tone unchanged. It is referenced, but not funded, which means it exists on paper, not in practice. And a quiet reaction moved through the room again, softer this time, but deeper, because it confirmed what they were already beginning to understand, that this was not one mistake, it was a pattern. One investor nodded slowly, tapping the table once with his finger. That explains the gap, he said, almost to himself, and another leaned forward, closing the distance between uncertainty and decision. The city lights outside continued to flicker against the glass, distant, untouched, but inside, every detail had sharpened, every assumption questioned, and at the center of it all stood someone who had not raised her voice, had not demanded attention, but had changed the direction of everything simply by seeing clearly. Ethan finally spoke again, quieter now, but more grounded than before. If we rebuild this, he said, his eyes still on Naomi, then you do not stand on the outside of it. And the words were not a command, not an offer wrapped in ego, but something closer to an invitation shaped by respect. And in that moment, the room understood that what had started as a dismissal had become something entirely different, something no one there had planned for, but none of them could ignore. The offer did not rush her, it lingered, suspended between possibility and memory, and Naomi felt it not as pressure, but as a weight she had carried before in different forms, in different rooms, where opportunity came wrapped in conditions that were never spoken out loud. She did not answer immediately, her eyes moving briefly across the table, the documents, the faces that had once overlooked her and now waited, and in that pause, something deeper surfaced, not doubt, but clarity. Rebuilding it means more than fixing numbers, she said finally, her voice calm, steady, but now carrying a quiet authority that no one questioned. It means changing how you see the risk in the first place. And the room listened, not because they were asked to, but because they had learned to. One of the investors nodded slightly, folding his hands together. Explain, he said, and the word held no impatience, only focus. Naomi glanced at the projections again, then back at them. You are assuming stability where there is none, she continued, and you are ignoring the variables that do not fit the narrative you want. And the phrasing was simple, but the meaning cut deeper than any technical explanation could, because it exposed not just an error, but a mindset. Ethan leaned forward, his attention fixed, no longer divided between control and presentation, but fully present in what was unfolding. What would you change? He asked, and this time, the question was not a test, it was a request. Naomi did not hesitate, not because she had prepared for this moment, but because she had lived in it long before tonight, in classrooms, in interviews, in spaces where her insight had been dismissed before it could be heard. First, you ground the model in what is already verified, she said, not what you hope will happen. And as she spoke, the room followed her logic, step by step, the same way they had followed Ethan earlier, but now with a different kind of trust. Second, you fund your contingency plan, she added, not as a backup you mention, but as a strategy you can execute. And a quiet shift moved through the table again, not dramatic, but decisive, because each adjustment she described was not just correction, it was structure, something they could build on instead of something they had to defend. One of the partners leaned back, exhaling slowly. That would cut the projected return, he noted, not as an objection, but as a realization. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she said simply, but it makes the return real. And that distinction settled over the room like a final piece falling into place, because in a space built on numbers, reality was the only thing that held value over time. Ethan's expression shifted again, not just respect now, but something closer to recognition of what he had almost missed, and he nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then we rebuild it your way, he said, and the words carried a weight that went beyond agreement. They acknowledged a shift in direction, in leadership, in perspective. Naomi did not smile, did not react outwardly, but something in her stance softened just slightly, not from validation, but from alignment, because this was not about proving herself. It never had been. it was about making sure the truth was seen once it had been spoken. The room remained still for a moment longer, not out of hesitation, but because everyone understood that what had just happened was not part of the plan. It was something better, something more precise, and in a room where power had once been assumed, it was now being redefined, quietly, clearly, and without apology. No one rushed to speak after that, because the decision had already been made, not with noise, but with alignment, the kind that settles into a room when everyone sees the same truth at the same time. One of the senior investors reached for his phone, not to check messages, but to send a brief instruction, a signal that what had been planned would not move forward as expected, and that subtle action carried more weight than any formal announcement could have. Ethan remained still for a moment longer, his hands resting on the table, his posture no longer performing control, but holding presence, and when he finally spoke again, his voice was different, stripped of assumption, grounded in something earned. "We paused the deal," he said, and no one questioned it, because it was no longer his authority they were following, it was the clarity that had been revealed. A quiet series of nods moved around the table, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just confirmation, and the documents that once represented certainty now sat as drafts, unfinished, waiting to be rebuilt from the ground up. Naomi did not react outwardly, did not claim the moment, but inside, there was a shift, not of triumph, but of recognition, the kind that comes when something long ignored finally becomes visible in a way that cannot be undone. The manager near the entrance took a hesitant step forward, then stopped again, unsure whether to return the room to its original rhythm, because the rhythm had changed, permanently, and no one wanted to interrupt what had just taken place. Ethan closed his laptop fully this time, not as an act of frustration, but as a decision, a line drawn between what had been and what would come next, and his gaze returned to Naomi, steady, direct, without the distance that had defined it before. "You said rebuild it," he continued, "then we rebuild it properly," and the words were not just agreement, they were commitment, shaped by something he had not brought into the room at the beginning of the night. One of the investors leaned forward again, his tone measured but clear. "If we move forward, we do it with full transparency this time," and the phrase landed firmly, setting a new standard, one that had not been demanded earlier because it had been assumed unnecessary. Naomi gave a slight nod, not approving, not endorsing, but acknowledging that the conversation had finally reached the level it should have started at, and for a brief moment, the room felt balanced in a way it had not before, not because power was equal, but because truth had been placed where everyone could see it. Ethan studied her again, not out of curiosity now, but with intent, as if measuring something beyond skill, something deeper, and when he spoke next, his voice carried a quiet certainty that matched the shift in the room. "You are not just someone who noticed," he said, "you are someone who understands," and the distinction mattered, because it separated observation from insight, presence from impact. Naomi met his gaze, steady as always, her expression unchanged, but the silence between them held a different meaning now, not distance, not dismissal, but recognition, and in that moment, the room no longer felt like a place she had entered to serve, it felt like a place she had altered simply by being exactly who she had always been. Outside, the city continued without pause, lights stretching into the distance, unaware of what had just shifted inside a single room high above it, but inside, every person present understood that what had been interrupted was not just a deal, it was a pattern, and what had replaced it was not just correction, but something far more valuable, something that could not be bought, only recognized when it finally spoke. The room did not return to what it had been, it moved forward into something else, something quieter but far more deliberate, and for the first time that night, no one was performing for anyone else, they were thinking, recalculating, adjusting in real time. One of the investors gathered the documents into a neat stack, not to close the conversation, but to reset it. "We will need a revised model within 48 hours, he said. His tone steady, no longer impressed by projections, only interested in proof, and the others nodded in agreement, not out of habit, but alignment. Ethan remained seated, but his posture had shifted completely, no longer leaning back, no longer occupying the space as if it belonged to him, but sitting forward, engaged, grounded, and when he spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier confidence that had filled the room, but something far more valuable, precision. "You will have it," he said. And the words were not a promise made to impress, but a commitment made to correct. Naomi stood quietly beside the table, her presence no longer questioned, no longer overlooked, and yet unchanged in its essence, because she had not come into the room to transform it, she had simply refused to ignore what she saw. the manager finally stepped closer, hesitant but composed, as if unsure how to restore order to a room that had redefined itself, but no one asked for service. No one reached for their glass, because what had just taken place had replaced every other priority. Ethan glanced toward Naomi again, not briefly, not passively, but intentionally, and there was a pause, not awkward, not uncertain, but necessary. "You should not be standing there," he said quietly, and the statement was not criticism, it was recognition of a truth that had become impossible to ignore. And Naomi did not respond immediately, her eyes steady, her posture unchanged, because she understood that statements like that were often followed by expectations, and she had learned to listen carefully before accepting what came next. Ethan continued, his tone even, controlled, but now carrying a clarity that had not been there before. "Not after what you just did," he added, and the room listened again, not out of curiosity, but because the shift in his voice mirrored the shift they had all experienced. One of the partners leaned back slightly, watching the exchange with a quiet interest, not intervening, not redirecting, because this moment did not belong to the deal anymore, it belonged to something else, something more human, more revealing. Naomi finally spoke, her voice calm, grounded. "I am exactly where I chose to be," she said, and the words were not defensive, not resistant, but honest, and that honesty carried its own kind of strength, the kind that did not need validation. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, not pushing back, not correcting, because he understood that control was no longer the point. Understanding was. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, steady and indifferent, but inside the room, something had settled into place, not a resolution, not yet, but a direction, one shaped not by who held the most power, but by who saw the most clearly. And for the first time that night, everyone in that room knew exactly who that was. The room no longer felt like a place of hierarchy, it felt like a place of decisions, and every person seated at that table understood that what came next would define not just the deal, but their judgment, their standards, and the kind of outcomes they were willing to stand behind. One of the investors stood slowly, not in dismissal, but in transition. "We reconvene tomorrow with a revised structure," he said, his tone clear, final. And the others followed, gathering their materials, not hurried, not distracted, but focused in a way that had not existed when the night began. Ethan remained seated for a moment longer, watching the room shift around him, watching people who had once leaned toward him now move with independent certainty, and he understood something he had avoided for too long, that leadership was not about holding attention, it was about earning trust, and trust had to be built on something real. Naomi turned slightly, preparing to step away, not out of dismissal, not out of retreat, but because her part, as she saw it, had been done, and she had no need to linger where she had not been invited before tonight. "Naomi," Ethan said, her name spoken clearly this time, not guessed, not assumed, and the sound of it carried a different weight than anything else he had said that evening. She paused, just enough to acknowledge, then turned back, her expression unchanged, her posture steady. Ethan stood now, not towering, not imposing, but meeting her at eye level in a way that removed distance rather than reinforcing it. "I owe you an apology," he said, and the words were simple, but in a room like this, they were rare, because power did not often admit fault without resistance. Naomi listened, not surprised, not moved outwardly, but attentive, because she understood that apologies could be gestures or they could be truths, and the difference mattered. "I dismissed you," he continued, his voice even, no longer carrying the rhythm of control, but the cadence of reflection, "before I even considered that you might see something I did not," and there was no excuse in his tone, no attempt to soften it, just acknowledgement, and that made it real. The room had quieted again. Not completely empty, but no longer filled with movement, because even those preparing to leave understood that this moment held its own kind of significance. Naomi met his gaze, steady as always, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same calm clarity that had shaped the entire night. "You did not dismiss me," she said, "you dismissed what you did not expect," and the distinction was subtle, but it shifted the meaning entirely. Because it was not personal, it was structural, it was about how people chose what to see and what to ignore. Ethan absorbed that, slowly, the realization settling deeper than any correction of numbers could, and he nodded once, not in agreement alone, but in understanding. Outside, the lights of the city stretched endlessly, constant, unaffected, but inside, something had reached a quiet conclusion, not of the story, but of a moment that had changed direction. Naomi gave a slight nod in return, not accepting the apology as a transaction, but acknowledging it as a step, and then she turned to leave, her pace steady, her presence unchanged, but the room she walked out of was no longer the same one she had entered, because what had once been invisible had been seen, and once seen, it could not be overlooked again. The door did not close loudly behind her, it barely made a sound, but the absence of her presence echoed through the room far more than any noise could have, and for a long moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already settled into place. Ethan remained standing, his gaze fixed on the space she had just walked through, not out of hesitation, but reflection. The kind that does not come from losing control, but from finally seeing it clearly for what it was. One of the investors adjusted his jacket, breaking the stillness just enough to signal the night was moving forward. "We will expect the revised model by noon tomorrow," he said, and the tone was no longer sharp, no longer skeptical, it was grounded, measured, because the standard had changed and everyone in the room knew it. Ethan nodded once, his response quiet but firm, and as the last of the investors made their way out, the room returned to something resembling calm, but not the same calm it had held before. This one was heavier, more aware, less certain in its assumptions and more careful in its conclusions. The manager stepped in cautiously, as if re-entering a space that had been reshaped, offering to reset the table, but Ethan raised a hand slightly, not dismissing him, but pausing the moment just a little longer, because something in that room still mattered beyond the plates and the glasses. He walked slowly to the window. The city stretching endlessly below, lights weaving through streets that did not pause, did not hesitate, and for the first time that night, he did not see it as something to control, but something to understand. His reflection stared back at him in the glass, sharp suit, composed posture, the image of someone who had built everything through certainty, and yet tonight, certainty had not come from him. It had come from someone he had almost ignored. He let out a slow breath, not out of frustration, not out of relief, but out of recognition, the kind that shifts something deeper than strategy or numbers ever could. Across the room, the table remained set, untouched in places, glasses half full, documents stacked, a silent reminder of how quickly confidence could be replaced by clarity, and somewhere between those two states, something more important had emerged, not a loss, not a failure, but a correction, one that would shape everything that came next. Ethan turned back toward the door, the same door she had walked through, and for a brief moment, he understood something that could not be written into any contract, something that could not be measured in percentages or projections. That power, the kind he had relied on for years, was only as strong as what it chose to see, and tonight, it had almost missed the only thing that mattered. He straightened slightly, not reclaiming the room, but stepping forward with a different awareness, one that did not rely on assumption, but on attention, and as he moved toward the exit, the city beyond the glass remained unchanged, but the way he saw it was not, because in a single night, in a single moment that no one had planned for, the room had not just been corrected, it had been redefined, and the truth that did it had not been loud, had not demanded space. It had simply stood there, steady and undeniable, until the world around it finally chose to listen. And long after the deal would be rebuilt, long after the numbers would be fixed and the structure refined, what remained was not the mistake that had been made, but the moment it had been seen, because she did not argue, she did not fight, she did not need to, she revealed, and in doing so, she changed everything.